Hello. Nordic pizza. My name is Meg Jensen, about as common a Scandinavian surname as you can get. Although I was born and raised in the suburbs of New York City and I've never actually visited a Scandinavian country, I'm inordinately proud of my Norwegian heritage in that American way. In my Irish, Polish, Italian neighborhood, the name Jensen stood apart. Jensen and the partial Norwegian heritage it represents were unusual, mysterious even, Viking. But about a year ago, I received a shocking email from my older sister. It was addressed to my brothers and myself, and the subject line stated simply, "We are no longer Norwegian." The email went on to explain that my sister had done a DNA test. This test had determined that our family roots were in fact Irish and English and nothing else. Let me explain briefly the ancestry we had previously understood to be our own. Okay, so this is my grandfather, Hjalmar, and my grandmother, Marie. This is all Marie's spinster Irish sisters. My father, who is, I guess, half Viking and half Irish. My mother, who's entirely Irish. So these are all my brothers and sisters. So theoretically, we should all be about 25% Viking and 75% Irish and English. Thank you. Beyond the genetics, though, from an early age, Ken Jensen was determined to teach us how much better it was to be Norwegian than any other nationality, despite the fact that he had never been to Norway himself, and he didn't much like his own father, who was the only Norwegian person he'd ever met. Norwegians, my father taught us, were brave, like Vikings. We were strong, like Vikings. We could ice skate. The historical accuracy of that Viking trait doesn't bear a great deal of scrutiny. We, like simple foods, stood straight, preferred winter to summer, and could, in fact, withstand any amount of cold. Indeed, we brought shame on ourselves and all Norsemen if we complained about cold showers, cold weather, or the ubiquitous freezing cold lakes, rivers, oceans, and creeks associated with all our family holidays. My father never took us to Florida. To be a Jensen was to be tough, morally upright, again, not sure how that works with the Viking thing, and up to any physical challenge that involved getting really, really, really cold. My sister's DNA test raised several obvious questions, like, if I'm not Scandinavian, why is my name Jensen? And how could our grandfather, who was born in Oslo and whose name was Hjalmar Jensen, not be Norwegian? But there was a deeper level of identity questioning going on here, too. Messages flew back and forth among my siblings with the subject line, #no longer Norwegian. My older brother recalled all of us watching the Winter Olympics when we were children and taking great pride in our Scandinavian roots. Well, that was a big waste of time, he said. My sister complained that she had always wanted to visit that ice hotel in Sweden, but now just looked like it would be really, really cold. In fact, at that very moment, my niece, another Jensen, was flying out to the ice hotel with her boyfriend, who was going to pop the question under the northern lights in an Instagrammable moment. The poor guy had been planning this trip for over a year in honor of her Nordic ancestry. Now all this hard work was going to be rendered meaningless by the results of my sister's savage spit-filled tube test. In fact, they did get engaged. There's the Instagram moment. They married in August, and I'm sure they'll live happily ever after. But all I could think about was the big snowstorm, or more accurately, the record-breaking blizzard of death of February 1978. I vividly recall waking that morning to the eerie quiet that meant only one thing: snow day. This most sacred of American holidays occurs when the weather is so awful that schools close and children with the wild eyes of escaped prisoners roam the streets with sleds and shovels in search of snowball fights. My father was sitting at the kitchen table with a lantern beside him, listening to the news on the transistor radio. The snow and ice had brought down power lines in the night, and arranged neatly in front of him was a phalanx of fully charged flashlights and about 500 emergency candles. Like Boy Scouts, Vikings were apparently always prepared. A string of ominous phrases volleyed forth from the radio: state of emergency, threat to life, make no unnecessary journeys. It must have been about 8 o'clock in the morning, but the kitchen was dark as night. Gray-white snowdrifts pressed up against the windows. Our house was buried. My dad, a kind but serious man who rarely showed emotion, looked up at me with a beaming, childlike smile. "Better get your galoshes," he said. "We're going to have to dig ourselves out." I want to point out that this was not Minnesota in the 1870s. I was not Laura Ingalls Wilder, and we had no animals in the barn waiting to be fed. This was suburban Long Island in the 1970s. We had a spare generator and a fridge full of Twinkies and spray cheese. Nevertheless, I sensed disobedience was not an option. My older siblings were still asleep, and my mother had quite wisely taken to her room. That left my younger brother and me on snow patrol. Several hours and frostbitten noses later, our little horde had carved a path through the snowdrifts and out onto the street. Not that we could see the street, as the cars themselves were buried and there were no signs of life anywhere. All normal, non-Nordic peoples were indoors. Our neighbors, the Clancys, the Wisbowers, and the Nunziatas, were all presumably inside sipping hot chocolate and playing cards. Okay, you kids, my dad said, go inside and get some dry clothes on. I think we deserve a reward. My brother and I turned and smiled to each other. Perhaps we too would soon be fishing mini marshmallows out of our cocoa. We should have known better. Vikings don't do hot chocolate. We duly changed and returned to the kitchen, where my father now stood shagged with ice and dripping onto the newspapers we had laid down on the linoleum floor. He was just hanging up the phone and had another huge smile on his face. This was clearly the happiest day of his life. Pull your boots on, kids, you're in for a treat, he said. In the background, the radio continued to warn of imminent snowy death to all who ventured out of doors. I just called Dante's Pizza, my father said. They haven't lost power. They are still open. Pizza. I looked out the window at the horizontal snowfall. My father was taking us out in that to get pizza. My brother and I glanced at each other furtively, waiting to see which of us would be first to mutiny. By the way, in case you think I'm exaggerating, here are a few photos of that storm. This is of the parkway near my house, or the highway near my house, as you can see, death to all people who drove. And then this is of the street next to mine. Pizza. My father must have sensed our hesitation. His shoulders fell and his newfound smile faded away. We had disappointed him. We had canceled his once-in-a-lifetime chance at an Arctic expedition. We had no right now to consider ourselves Norwegian. My brother was the first to surrender, pulling on his still wet boots and zipping up his parka with grim determination. Pepperoni, he said. They better have pepperoni. My father turned to me, smiling once again. I knew now that resistance was futile. What was normally a 10-minute journey to Dante's Pizza and back took us over 3 hours that day. We lost my little brother completely for a half hour on the trip. And after all our efforts, our heroic journey ended with us sitting on wet newspapers eating half-frozen slices of soggy pizza. I did not complain, and neither did my brother, who had inhaled a potentially life-threatening amount of snow. Making my father proud of his little Vikings was clearly worth risking our lives. Or so we had thought. Now the DNA test had rendered this hallowed family saga and all our other icy, snowy family adventures as idiotic. We were seriously pissed at my sister for doing the test in the first place. My younger brother refused to accept this new reality of hashtag no longer Norwegian. He disputed the test results, arguing that they depended too heavily on relatively small amounts of data. My older brother wondered if maybe my sister had been adopted. I should get my own test, he said. I'm pretty sure I'm still Norwegian. I had more elaborate family secrets in mind. Maybe my mother had had an affair. Or maybe my father was the love child of one of those many maiden spinster aunts. We knew that my father and his father did not get along very well. Maybe that's because Hjalmar was stuck raising a little Irish bastard. Or maybe Hjalmar himself was adopted. Who the hell knows what went on in Oslo back in those days? The one thing we all knew, all agreed upon, was this. Thank God my father wasn't alive to find out he was no longer Norwegian. For if he was, he'd be feeling like we did now. Listless in the face of snow and ice, bored by ski wear and luge races, no longer willing to jump straight into a swimming pool without testing the water first. I found myself whining a lot about the weather, like regular people do. Life without being Norwegian was safe and dull and rather flat. And then, in January, about 6 months after the first deadly email, my sister blithely sent us all another one, to wit, just got an update from Ancestry.com. They now have more samples and can better identify regions. Turns out we are less English, more Irish, and 7% Scandinavian. 7%. Okay, so it wasn't 25%, but it was something. 7% was real. 7% was science. 7% Scandinavian was 7% brave and strong and morally upright, and 7% good posture. Well, that was all I needed to hear. I opened the door and headed outside without my coat. It wasn't snowing, but the sky was dark and a brisk wind was blowing in from the north. Up in Valhalla, my father was sitting on soaking wet newspapers and eating a half-frozen slice of pepperoni pizza, and he was smiling.